And welcome to you all. It's a little warm in here, so we're trying to cool it off, and it's wonderful to see so many folks out this evening as there were last Friday. Welcome to the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series and to tonight's panel discussion. Then we came forth to see again the stars on reading Dante and his significance for us. Tonight's panel is part of the Carol J. Worrell Annual Lecture Series on literature, and more information on the Worrell Endowment is in the flyer available. I want to mention that next week on Tuesday, March 1st at 7 p.m. here in the Great Hall, we are hosting the Baltimore Consort Musical Ensemble for a performance titled The Food of Love, Songs, Dances, and Fancies for Shakespeare. Much more information is in the flyer that has gone out. Please take a look. Then on Friday, March 4th, in a happy coincidence, I think, since the consort was originally to perform some weeks ago, there will also be a performance of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, staged by our student theater group Chrysostomos, with other performances through the weekend, I believe. Also on Friday at 12:15 to 1:15 in the Junior Common Room, there will be a lunchtime concert of Fauré Piano Works 1 by Peter Pesic, who's here this evening, our musician in residence. You are all invited to join us for all these occasions. It'll be a week of music and theater. Then we came forth to see again the stars, the closing line of Dante's Inferno. E quindi uscimo a rivedere le stelle, stelle, the stars, the last word of all three cantiche of the Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. The line somehow seemed a natural one to reach for, in an academic year in which we have ventured cautiously back out into the world, back to our campuses, out of isolation, and at a time when the simple beauty and majesty of our natural setting and our pellucid, starry sky here in Santa Fe have often been a consolation. And we all need such consolation, as the awful news this week of war in Ukraine reminds us once again. In a completely unrelated coincidence, the phrase was used on the cover of our college's annual report this month. I don't know all the thinking behind that, but it may have been to acknowledge similar emotions, joined to the sense that our college more broadly has emerged from present challenges with signs of hope and progress. Among other things, in this tentative but hopeful year, we have not often been able to plan far ahead. I'm extremely grateful to the tutors who are presenting this evening for taking this up together amid so many other duties, impromptu and at my request, just a few weeks ago. After my introduction, we will hear short papers or talks from my 5 colleagues, Alison Chapman, Guillermo Bleichmar, Sarah Stickney, Paola Villa, and Michael Golluber, in that order, I believe. After Mr. Golluber concludes, we will adjourn as usual for about 10 minutes of break and refreshments. Then we will return to this space, to the Great Hall, for a question period and conversation. We hope many of you will stay and join us. Dante needs no introduction, but I'll give one. Let me repeat some of what made this timely. Dante completed his Commedia in 1320 and died in 1321. The 700th anniversaries of both events over 2 years occasion new additions and renewed attention to this foundational work of poetry, literature, philosophy, theology. That list could go on. Here at the college, we have had study groups and lectures on Dante over the last several years. Dante's work is one of the major engagements of the St. John's program and of the sophomore year, but it is also a consistently puzzling work, at turns beautiful and inviting, and then dense and inscrutable. I want to highlight that in the 2019-2020 academic year, Tutor John Cornell, who's here this evening, led a year-long study group not only on the Comedy, but on other less-read works of Dante, such as La Vita Nuova and the Convivio. I'm going to borrow some of his words. Mr. Cornell began a description of his group this way. According to some weighty critical opinion, Dante is one of the 2 greatest poets since antiquity. He is certainly a man on a mission and must be credited with reviving the tradition of epic poetry that had lain dormant for a good 1,000 years. The Divine Comedy energizes many of us and our students on a first reading, yet as tutors we may not feel that we advance very far beyond that, as we revisit the work at several year intervals with new seminars. I thought we might profit from an opportunity to discuss the comedy together with focus, end quote. He then elaborated some of the puzzles we might encounter. So again, quoting Mr. Cornell. So many cantos are rife with ambiguities. The poet often addresses his readers, offering what look like interpretive clues, though we are rarely sure what to make of them. Is he a traditional Christian believer aiming to convert his audience, a prophet remaking his ruined world, a scholastic symphonist composing in verse, a secret Averroist attempting to destroy theocracy with Greek political philosophy? Or is he the first psychologist of the unconscious and its symbols? I myself am curious about Dante's role in what Nietzsche took to be the defining moment of the European spirit, the gai saber of the troubadours. Troubadour poets had caught the Platonic love bug from the Muslim scholars. Now Dante takes their courtly poetics to its extreme. He divinizes Beatrice. He professes to be the new expert on Eros. How challenging to church authority did he intend his love manifesto, his comedy, to be, end quote. Thank you, Mr. Cornell, for letting me borrow your words. Mr. Cornell later delivered two superb lectures here on Dante, at least two that I know of, one of which became an article in the journal Interpretation titled Senza Mezzo, a reading of Dante's Paradiso, cantos 5 through 7. I commend it to your attention. I want to thank Mr. Cornell for elevating Dante for renewed consideration over these last several years. It's this combination of enchantment and bewilderment evoked by Dante for many of us that has inspired us tonight. We all, but our sophomores in particular, who have just concluded their reading of the comedy, might benefit from an evening of varied explorations of the text. And our speakers have not coordinated their talks, so we will indeed wander on our pilgrim's way tonight. There is another source of inspiration in the background for us. Last year, tutor and alumnus Carrie Stickney, a man who as much as any was the heart and soul of our campus, died on April 7th. We have, of necessity, long delayed a proper memorial on our campus. We do hope to have one this coming fall. But as we approach one cycle around the sun since his passing, we wish to dedicate this occasion to the dear friend and teacher of so many at the college. Carrie loved many books, but Dante's comedy was one of his special beloveds. He offered at least 2 lectures on Dante that I'm aware of, one in 2013, titled Thoughts on Canto 33 of the Inferno, a reading of the terrible story of Ugolino, a somber reading, but one filled with hope and light. And an earlier lecture delivered in January 1986, published in the spring 1986 edition of the St. John's Review, titled On Beginning to Read Dante. Both can be found in our digital archives. I have just reread them and I commend them both to you. Carrie was a central member of Mr. Cornell's study group, and for some of us that was the last chance we had to read with Carrie, and you couldn't read with him without learning, and learning surprising things from and with him. We are not here to say more about him tonight, that's for another day, but we trust he would be pleased to have more reading and conversation about Dante offered in his honor, and so this is. Now please join me in welcoming Ms. Chapman and all our speakers.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. In the middle of a garden in the 7e arrondissement, or 7th circle of Paris, admirers of the artist Auguste Rodin may find themselves standing in front of one of his greatest, though unfinished works, The Gates of Hell. The 20-foot-tall bronze statue contains nearly 200 distinct sinners, inspired by Dante's Inferno, most of whom will be found writhing in unimaginable pain. Each figure was molded, pressed, carved, and hollowed out painstakingly by the artist's hand before he cast the molten bronze in furnaces reaching 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Rodin would work on the gates for 37 years, dreaming about them feverishly most nights, before determining the project was impossible and abandoning it. I want to suggest that Rodin, like many artists, fell into a kind of trap when it comes to representing Inferno and its gates. Seduced by the brutal materiality of hell, Rodin felt called to try to render it in blaring metallic imagery. But as I want to explore this evening, there are dangers that emerge from trying to capture Inferno's torments in an instant. Instead, hell is a problem that requires a particular kind of reading to resolve. The gates that greet Dante the Pilgrim at the very beginning of Canto 3 therefore contain no images of the kind that we see in the Aeneid's exquisite gates of Cumae, nor on the shield of Achilles. Indeed, the carved letters on Dante's gates are not described at all, but rather transcribed, appearing to us exactly as they would appear to the pilgrim himself. To make this effect clear, many editions of the text will print these words in block letters on the page, a visual reminder that we are seeing the carvings as though without the mediation of Dante's rendering. The world of poetry has momentarily collapsed. The imagination has flattened itself against this simple surface. our inner interpretive capacity has been reduced to its lowest degree. Readers of the Inferno simply turn the page and find the words, "Through me, the way into the grieving city. Through me, the way into eternal sorrow. Through me, the way among the lost people. Justice moved my high maker. Divine power made me, highest wisdom and primal love. Before me were no things created except eternal ones, and I endure eternal. Abandon every hope, you who enter." There are many questions to be asked about this gate. What does it mean that it owes its creation to divine justice and primal love? Why was it made before there were any created beings in the world? How could it predate even the fall of man? But I'm going to focus my talk today on a smaller and seemingly peripheral question. Why does the gate speak for itself? The literary term for this effect is prosopopeia. St. John students will recognize in this word its Greek roots, prosopon, the face, and poieo, to make. The aim of prosopopeia is thus to create a face or a mask or a voice for an inanimate thing. It is part of a recurring pattern that Carrie Stickney noted in his lecture on Inferno, the tendency for voice to detach itself from a human speaker. Prosopopeia is, most commonly, the language of tombstones, a linguistic presence that announces an absence. In a sense, then, it is fitting to inaugurate the entrance to hell, the gate which, unlike the one that surrounds the city of Dis, stands always open. What is the purpose of a gate that does not close? No one guards this gate, and nothing happens when one crosses its boundary. It is a structure that articulates an emptiness, seemingly meaningless as an object, but for the fact that it can be read. In many ways, hell is a place that insists upon its legibility. As we encounter every sinner suffering their contrapasso, we are repeatedly drawn into interpretive relationships with things seen. How is Epicureanism itself like being stuffed into a sarcophagus? At times, the relationship between crime and punishment is almost grotesquely facile. Of course, the schismatics should have their bodies repeatedly split. Naturally, the false prophets should be doomed not to look ahead, but rather to gaze twistingly at their own buttocks. As readers, we feel over and over again that by staring into these junctures, we are grasping revelatory insights into the nature of divine justice. But as we discussed in my seminar last week, it seems strange to imagine that the splendors of God's cosmic plan could find language in contorted bodies and seared flesh. And the idea that pain bears truth does not seem like a mode of revelation befitting of divinity, but rather like the all-too-human logic of the torturer. Indeed, in many respects, hell seems rather to be a place of misreading rather than truth-seeking. Thus, Dante the Pilgrim first believes the giants Nimrod, Ephialtes, and Antaeus to be the towers of some infernal city. At a later moment, he nearly mistakes Lucifer himself for a windmill. Hell wants for us to read it, and yet at the same time, reading in Inferno risks capitulating to its grinding, mechanistic form. Its logic is gravitational, hyper-expressive, and ironclad. In Canto 8, Virgil will recall the inscription on top of Hell's gates and refer to it as la scritta morta, or dead writing. What does it mean for writing to die? The word scritta comes from the Latin noun scrite, derived from a past participle of scribere, to write. The word itself thus throws us into a memorial past, that which was written. It is movement that has become fixed and petrified. Its etymology reminds us that writing is always a mediated experience, never a direct encounter with either the writer or the subject of their rendering. I want to pause here and consider the importance of mediation and suggest it might have a peculiar significance in the depths of hell. To do so, I need to borrow a guide. In analyzing sense perception in De Anima, Aristotle produces a surprising articulation of physical touch. When we perceive, we are told, every sensation must travel to the proper receptive organ through some kind of medium. Thus, sight and sound move through air or water. But for touch, the medium for perception is, strangely, our own flesh. And as such, every tactile encounter with some apparently external body is in some way, primarily, an encounter with ourselves. I certainly don't need to impress upon St. John students the influence of Aristotle on Dante, even if that influence was secondhand. But I wonder if the poet might have, alongside the philosopher's ethics and physics, also taken up Aristotle's physiology of touch when imagining how justice finds articulation in the suffering of sinners. Flesh, I understand, poses some problem when we consider the sinners as shades, but as they are shades who can be burnt, whipped, and cut, and who blush, sweat, and cry, I'll ask for your leniency. If we push on the idea further, it may be fair to say that pain alienates man from the external cosmic structures of the world, rather than putting him in contact with it. It perhaps explains why the sinners seem so isolated. They have no desire to speak to one another, and almost never express regret or revelation. pain is solipsistic and enclosed, the self encountering itself over and over ad nauseum. And it is not just a philosophical problem, but a representational one too. Aristotle's theory of perception asserts that physical pain is something self-reflexive rather than expressive, whose force is, despite the phantasmagoria that the poem offers, ultimately imperceptible to us. Pain is simply not meaningful at a distance. In some ways, the problem of hell is a problem of formal enclosure, which pain represents at its smallest level. Throughout the poem, Inferno appears to contain and structure things that have themselves no proper end. Here we might think of Thomas Aquinas' idea that sin has no formal cause, or more simply recall Inferno's many hybrid beasts. I wonder if it makes sense to think of the sinners, with their repetitive experience of pain and their straining voices, as trying to insist on an identity that can find no natural equilibrium with the universe, that could never come to a position of rest. They are doomed to repeat and reaffirm themselves, because there is no outside account that can make sense of them. Except, that is, for poetry. As the poem progresses, Dante seems more and more focused on the problem of making poetry out of something that seems to deplete the world of its revelatory insights. Lacking both the time and the wisdom to speak more comprehensively about Dante's poetic tactics, I'll just touch briefly on his encounter with Lucifer in Inferno's final canto, where the poet asks us to, and I quote, "See how great must be the whole that fits with such a part." This might seem like a failure of art to convey meaning by asking us to look at precisely what is not being rendered, the entirety of the cosmos and Lucifer's lost beauty. But by requiring that we hold space for the invisible in the presence of what is seen, Dante is also affirming a fundamental element of the poetic imagination, the part that reinfuses a dead world with signification. Whether through metaphor or simile, or as here synecdoche, poetry voices the gentle tug towards something that is not directly before our eyes, something that needs to be spoken into existence. For Dante, poetry is a heightening of intellectual perspective, a way of opening outwards to the world. Perhaps this is why Lucifer himself is not something that we stop to interpret or fixate upon, but something that we climb in order to change our point of view. On the one hand, this imaginative effort of expansion is precisely what Dante's Gates of Hell try to get us to abandon. The stony, hard, concretizing speech insists that we not look beyond the sheer fact of its inscription. But of course, we also know that these gates are a part of something unimaginably greater and more divine. Dante's hell is inconclusive. Its gates stand open to remind us that, whatever might be said of the sinners therein, Inferno itself is not enclosed. Enclosure is, after all, the form of tragedy. As we learn in the Poetics, tragic form has a clear beginning, middle, and end. But Dante is writing a comedy, whose edges of meaning have always been more blurred as it tries to connect with something outside of itself. Rodin discovered the incompletion of hell accidentally. In trying to represent its gates as an image, he tacitly smuggled in the idea that Inferno was a comprehensive whole that could be seen at once and circumscribed with clear edges. And in trying to make suffering itself a source of intrinsic meaning, in committing what seems to be both a moral and an aesthetic error, Rodin started an artwork that could never be complete. Dante, on the other hand, was never so deceived. The most important thing we do at his gates is move through them. Thank you.
In the next few minutes, I would like to consider an aspect of Dante's poetry that has always appealed to me and that could be interesting to think about together. Namely, the great care he takes in producing a closely detailed, internally coherent picture of the supernatural places in the poem. I will give some examples of this careful work of his imagination and try to begin to think about their meaning. The first lines of the comedy present us with a landscape that seems allegorical. Lost in a mysterious and rather nondescript wilderness, Dante encounters three frightening beasts that are heraldic pictures of sin. The setting seems like the symbolic representation of a spiritual state. But almost at once, details are given that place us more firmly in a structured setting. He says, "When I had reached the foot of a hill, I looked up and saw its shoulders already clad in the rays of the planet that leads men aright by every path." Now, there is a spatial logic here that is not allegorical. The sun is either behind Dante, but still beneath the horizon, and thus reaching only the facing top of the high hill, or it is on the other side of the hill, and its light can just be discerned along the rim. So there's been a kind of quick, almost insensible triangulation, and we are suddenly in a concrete world, just as when, in the evening, if you look up and see a sky, an airplane that is still lit by the sun that has already set, you see it in that light. Then as Dante begins to skirt the hill, he adds what seems like a small topographical detail. He says, "I again took up my way across the desert strand, so that the firm foot was always the lower. Now we know that the slope of the hill rises to his left, which again situates us more concretely in the place Dante presents to our imagination." We also know that if this is an allegory, it is one where the laws of walking on hillsides apply. Finally, Dante adds a temporal marker. It was the beginning of the morning, and the sun was mounting with the stars that were with it, when divine love first set those beautiful things in motion. The commentaries point to a medieval tradition according to which the sun was in the constellation Aries when the world was first created. In any case, we now also know that the Divine Comedy takes place in late March or early April. As you go through the comedy, you will find many instances of these three types of imagined specificity: spatial, temporal, and topographical, by which I mean sort of a careful description of a certain space, not only in terms of its shape and its dimensions, but also of its particular relation to the body, how we would move through it, and how we would appear in perspective to our senses. Dante's spatial description of hell is so detailed in its dimensions and its geographical position within the earth that Galileo, in his youth, was able to write a series of lectures where he derived the actual volume of the pit of hell. And then he later realized that the roof of hell, so the piece of the earth's crust that covers the pit, would be too broad and would collapse under its own weight. But think of all the information Dante had to provide for Galileo to be able to do that. Another example of Dante's detailed imaginative work is the way in which, as he sort of ascends and circles purgatory, he keeps in mind a coherent spatial and temporal picture of his position on the mountain and of the sun in the sky, so that he can tell, according to where he is in the ascent of purgatory, which way his shadow would point, depending on the sun. And here, as in many astronomical asides throughout the comedy, time and space are represented not just individually in a very careful way, but also in a kind of coherent interconnection. And I think Dante must have drawn the situation on a piece of paper, or he must have made a physical model of it to be able to sort of figure out where he was on the snail shell of purgatory. So that's another example. The attempt to produce a coherent spatial and temporal picture is sustained even into the highest reaches of paradise, which Dante admits is fundamentally a refracted vision of spiritual things, and thus at some level a kind of hallucination. Perhaps the most daring and remarkable instance is the final vision of the cosmos that Dante relates while standing on top of the heaven of the stars and looking down through the nested crystalline spheres of the planets at a very tiny earth, which he describes as the little threshing floor, which makes us all so fierce. This vision is too long for me to read it to you here, but you can find it at the end of Canto 22 in Purgatory. And I think if you read it, you'll find that there's not much in Western literature that compares to that moment until the sort of photographs of the Earth as seen from space in the 1970s. Now, the examples I have given so far, which are spatial, temporal, and topographical, can be connected as well to the imaginative detail in which Dante pictures everything that takes place within the three realms of the comedy, from personalities and psychological dispositions to forms of punishment, penance, and spiritual fulfillment. And so I thought I would just mention some of the things that Dante imagines in the course of the comedy: the writing on the gates of hell, the bureaucracy of divine vengeance and purgation, the sounds of the common language of mankind before the Tower of Babel, the physical disorientation that you would experience in crossing the center of the world, where top and bottom switch places as you go at Satan's crotch, essentially. He also imagines the shape of constellations that can only be seen from deep within the southern hemisphere, and so would have been entirely invisible to Europeans of Dante's time. The epistemology of the damned, the way a ghostly shade forms around each soul in purgatory as a kind of vaporous condensation, the supernatural optics of heaven, and which specific song is sung on each rung of purgatory and paradise, and so on, and so on. And I will just give you one more example that has always, for some reason, struck me as especially moving. And it's that when Dante and Virgil first get to purgatory, Cato tells them that they have to go down to the shore, and Virgil has to gird Dante with the rushes that grow there. And he says, "This little island, round about its very base, down there where the wave beats it, bears rushes on its soft mud. No other plant which would put forth leaf or harden can live there, because it yields not to the buffetings." So not only does Dante imagine that the mountain of purgatory has a muddy shore, as if trying to sense sort of like the very edge where it begins, and not only does he imagine that certain plants might grow there, but he points out that there would be a logic determining which specific coastal plant could grow there so close to the action of the waves. Now, at one level, the rush is obviously a symbol of humility, but in Cato's explanation, it's almost like we see the imagination of a naturalist at work. Maybe it's because I'm reading Darwin for senior seminar, but it seems like something Darwin would appreciate. Now, having given some examples of Dante's imaginative work in the Divine Comedy, I will just close by asking a question that I hope you can help me think about. The question is, what psychological and moral dispositions on Dante's part and what effects on the reader's mind can be associated with this careful work of the imagination? Vividness, per se, is not necessarily to be celebrated. Every TV show, every movie, every video game, every novel, every paranoid conspiracy theory, every railroad model built in someone's basement is an exercise in the production of an internally coherent fiction, or what these days we might call a virtual reality. And as we face increasingly sophisticated and entrancing virtual realities, it seems important to ask whether the impulse to imagine other worlds in great detail, or to enter into them once they have been imagined by others, is not at risk of making us fall into just another version of Plato's cave. My own sense is that there is something enlivening and ultimately, though I'm not sure in every instance, salutary about Dante's use of the imagination. Possibly what appeals to me in the spatial and temporal examples I have given is the sense that they force or they invite the mind to adopt a position outside itself. And this can take place in several ways. Temporally, through a sense of simultaneity. Each time Virgil briefly reminds Dante of the time or the position of the stars as they traverse the blind world of the Inferno, we sense the possibility of an abiding order, a sense of calm beyond the violent passions that invade the mind. Spatially, it can happen through the sense of a structured logic to the world, a logic that does not bend to particular desire and whose understanding and navigation require careful attention. And finally, between human beings, by the attempt to picture or to infer another person's inner world or their perspectival position within a shared external world. In some cases, the aim seems to be to lead the mind into what we might call an objective position. In others, to allow it to enter into a different kind of subjectivity. And in yet others, and here to my mind may be one of the distinguishing features of the comedy with respect to other closely constructed fictions, to pay attention to the way in which the mind moves between the inner world of its fears and desires and the outer world of civic and physical existence. So that on the one hand, you have the inescapable yet creative self-centeredness over mental experience, and on the other, you have the Copernican readjustments of which we may be capable. Thank you.
My father loved the kind of music that made you want to get up and dance while simultaneously expressing great pain and sorrow. Like Dante, he had a deep appreciation for the way that seeming opposites are often inextricably linked, and like Dante, he was permanently attracted to paradox. Because this panel is in part in honor of him, I thought I would try to think about one of those moments of intense paradox. So I'm going to circle back around to the gates and ask a question that really stumps me, namely, how is it that love made hell? When I was 16, my father had a sabbatical, and we all went to spend the year in Florence, in part to eat, of course, but in part so he and my mother could study Dante. In those long ago days, the lira was the currency, English was taught about as well as foreign languages are taught here in the US, and the public school up the hill let me be a student even though I had no papers. Like Dante, I fainted from fear at first, but the beautiful country dove il si suona, where the yes resounds, as Dante says, not only welcomed me, but went on to give me rich and lasting guest gifts. Because Dante was the unmoved mover who brought us there, he is especially dear to me. In our aged apartment in Florence, the floor of each room slanted a different direction. So an egg on the stove tilted one way, while the bed in the adjoining room tipped another. In this place, my father often worked on memorizing portions of the poem out loud. And one of his very favorite sections, a lover of drama and of darkness, was those fateful lines inscribed above the gate to hell. I will say them now so we can hear their marvelous sound. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. Giustizia mosse il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina podestate, la somma sapienza e il primo amore. Dinanzi a me non fuor cose create se non eterne, e io eterno duro. Lasciate ogni speranza, voi che entrate. I feel about these lines very much as Dante does when he says immediately after Virgil, "Teacher, the meaning here is hard for me." I am taking advantage of this panel format to coerce the rest of you, and especially those students who have just read the comedy, to help me think about it. But since I've now taken up most of my time in introductory blather, also I can certainly claim in honor of my father, I'd better hop too. I love that the writing on the gate is like the voice of something living, by means of me, instrumental dative. It has a self that it refers to. Like the many people Dante encounters on his journey, it is telling us who it is and how it got there. And it has a way with words. The anaphora, that repetition that begins the first three lines, is very satisfying to the ear. In part, perhaps, because it's made of single syllables. It's like a snare drum, per me si va, that introduces the keening flute of the dolente, dolore, gente, that ends the lines. First, it tells us what it does. Then it tells us how it came to be there. Justice moved my high maker. Divine authority made me, the highest wisdom and primal love, or maybe first love. I think of justice as an umbrella over the making. Justice created the impulse to make. Justice was the architect with the vision, while authority, wisdom, and love were the contractors who did the actual building. There's a lot to be thought about here with these four giant abstract nouns, especially that first one, justice. Even though the JFs I have the pleasure to be in conversation with this semester have only had a dozen seminars, justice has already shown itself to be an essential and demanding concern of human life. Still, I'm here for love, so I'm moving on. Love is the final noun mentioned, which puts it in a position of strength. Because it finishes a group of three, I've wondered if it might be occupying the position the Holy Spirit occupies in the Trinity. The Holy Spirit seems like the most mysterious aspect of the Trinity. I sort of think of it as Hermes, like the messenger, the diplomat, alchemical glue, the thing that can travel between realms, but you don't really know like whose side he's on. Now that we're in conversation with the gate, we can re-ask the question, why would love have anything to do with hell? Hell is not primarily a place of punishment, as many have claimed, but a place of suffering. The gate does not speak of punishment, but of dolore and its adjective dolente, which comes straight from the Latin, pain, grief, sorrow, suffering. If you have ever been exposed to, say, this life we're all leading, you know that it too is a place of suffering. This turns out to be kind of a problem for humans, and practically every book we read attempts to address it. So love has made or helped to make a place of eternal suffering. Why? It seems to me that one way to think about Dante's hell is as a place in which the choice between love and some other smaller, meaner possibility is eternally present. Ugolino, that darkest of examples and another of my father's favorites, is not without love. He loves his children. Indeed, the fact that he loves them so much is part of the genius of his enemies' nightmarish punishment. He must watch them starve, which is far worse than simply starving himself. But instead of turning towards the love that he feels for them, he turns first toward the anger he feels for his enemy, and then to numbness. I think Dante makes it clear that his anger is more than justified. That's often the problem with anger, as Achilles knows. It's just. And yet. It, like other principles that are not love, can lead to stasis, which is another word for what I'm calling numbness. Or, as Ugolino says himself, he turned to stone. When I think of him in his tower, the nearly 24 hours of darkness are like the numbness, and that slit that lets in light ever so briefly once or twice a day is the presence of the possibility of love. It's no bigger than a sliver, but it's there. Ugolino turns away from it in part because turning towards love is going to cause more feeling, whereas going numb will dull the sensation. As he says, io non piangea, si dentro impetrai, piangevan egli. It's a beautiful chiasmus in which the stone he turns into occupies the center, and it's surrounded by weeping, the weeping he didn't do on one side, and the weeping his children did on the other. Weeping is worth thinking about as a kind of opposite of stasis. It's a motion that flows through us, that reminds us that we are dynamic, living, and feeling. Francesca in Canto 5 represents another gentler example. I have a real soft spot for Francesca, so it's hard for me to criticize her, but I'll try. When she's telling her story to Dante, she explains that the problem was, love, which pardons no one from loving, grabbed me. The beautiful repetition in the Italian, amor canullo amato amar perdona, sounds like a lullaby that will send the will to sleep. How marvelous to take no blame. It wasn't me. It was done to me. I had no choice. But we do. That's part of what's painful. We do have a choice. It seems to me that if Francesca had admitted to making a choice, a movement in which the intellect or reason moves along with the desire, she might eventually have been Piccarda's companion in paradise, even if she had betrayed her husband and her vows. Both these examples show that it takes great courage to love. And indeed, it seems to me quite important that the very first people we see in hell right after passing through the gate are the cowardly, those who attempted moral neutrality and lived without disgrace and without praise. They too chose a kind of stoniness in the face of life, a refusal to be animated. If love then is the principal activity, the movement, and therefore life itself, it has to be freely turned toward and freely chosen. Anything coerced isn't love. Dante was an early adopter of consent. This is as true for a dalliance as it's true for God in relation to his creation. If God were to force us to love him, it wouldn't be love. Dante's hell dramatizes that thought because the stories told within it reveal again and again the possibility of love and the turning away from it. Possibility or potency is a species of presence, as Aristotle teaches us. And indeed, the people who are in hell are not there because of how bad they were, but because of how numb they decided to be in the face of the possibility of love. Love made hell because the ultimate freedom of a human being is that she gets to decide whether to take on the burden of love. If you believe that Dante is a believer, you could say that the highest mark of God's love for us is that he gives us the freedom to choose love ourselves. If you believe Dante is an atheist, and Mr. Golluber is about to teach us how to do that, then hell is an image of the way that love remains present as a possibility, even in the grimmest of situations. When we don't choose it, we rob time of the ways in which time can help us continue to grow and change. We become unchanging, stony, and in that case, a lifetime may as well be an eternity.
Buonasera. The heaven of the sun in Canto 10 of Paradiso, the heaven of wisdom, is ripe with powerful and mysterious images suggesting a communion of love, knowledge, and order. In the very first verses, God brings about spatial and temporal order by engaging in a loving exchange of gazes with his Son and the Holy Spirit. Echoes of this amorous relation between the Trinity and creation are sewn into the very fabric of the canto. From Dante's reference to the minor triad of genius, practice, and art, to the garland of saints like St. Thomas Aquinas and wise men like Solomon, that rotate 3 times encircling Dante and Beatrice, to the very end of the canto, with the most erotic image of a clock ever written in literature. I have to admit that the idea of Thomas Aquinas joyously dancing around in circle, holding hands with some of the greatest and gravest intellectuals of the time, like ladies, said Dante, has a certain appeal after 5 seminars on the Summa. But this is not just a fun intermezzo for Dante. And if we look at the composition of the garland, we find something deeply moving and unexpected. Thomas Aquinas is holding hands on one side with Albertus Magnus, who was a master of theology in Paris at Sorbonne and teacher of Aquinas, and on the other side with Siger of Brabant, a so-called heretic, an Averroist who was condemned by Tempier in the famous condemnation of 1277. I don't have time here to discuss the details of the nature of Siger of Brabant's heresy, but I just wanted to point out the apparent dissonance of having him redeemed among the wise men in paradise and holding hands with the 2 people who condemned his writing and his ideas. Canto 10 presents us with a series of conundrums that seem irreconcilable under one single interpretation. In the heaven of wisdom, we find explicit images of Eros. We encounter an heretic dancing with canonized theologians, and this somehow all infused with the presence of the idea of the Trinity. So, what is really happening here? Let's take a step back. A few verses into the beginning of the canto, Dante asks his readers to lift their eyes and direct them with love and longing, vagheggiare in Italian, to the point where the circle of the ecliptic meets the celestial equator. Watching the sky is one of the most elemental experiences of humanity, a practice that is intimately connected with the activity of thinking. As the sidereal and celestial roots of the verb to consider and to contemplate remind us. Dante is calling our attention to the ancient Platonic myth of the origin of the universe with the wielding together in the shape of an X of the circle of the same and the other, reconfigured in Ptolemaic astronomy in the celestial equator and the ecliptic. He's juxtaposing the Trinitarian representation of a perfect, circular, symmetric, amorous relationship to the image of unnecessary asymmetry right at the core of the heavens, at the origin of the very possibility of life on Earth. The two movements of the sun, annual and diurnal, while breaking the symmetry of a single circle, create a spiral, a crooked road, as Dante calls it, in stark contradiction with the beginning of the poem, che la dritta via era smarrita, the straight road that was lost in the obscure woods. The crookedness of the two circles also describe an imaginary double chiasmus, so a double X, meeting at the point of equilibrium, the two equinoxes. The chiasmus is an important rhetorical figure in the economy of paradise, and especially present in the heaven of the sun. Bridging the gap between distant parts of the discourse with its cross-like structure, ABA, the chiasmus seems to take on the burden of allowing for the narrative to evolve into a constant reconciliation of opposites. More than in previous circles, Dante is now facing the blinding, paralyzing possibility of silence. Already in the Heaven of the Moon, Dante was painfully aware of the inadequacy of language to describe his experience. Transhumanar, significar per verba non si poria. Transhumanize, to pass beyond human, is an experience that cannot be signified through words. But, as he says in this canto, he who does not put wings to fly up there might as well wait for the news from the mute. Dante plays with his own surname, Alighieri, which contains wings, ali in Italian. But seriously, aside from playing with words, how can a poet transcend his own language? How does one escape the inexorable gaze of Medusa and fly past the petrification of one's own creative expression? And in reverse, how does one describe an experience so delicate and powerful as love and the love for God without forcing it into una morte, which means both one love and one death in Italian, as Francesca did in Inferno? How can the word become incarnate and yet be eternal? Well, ignoring the counsel of Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, who told his students that the X never, ever marks the spot for a buried treasure, I contend that the answer, or the beginning of an answer, resides precisely in the X, in that chiasmus that keeps together divergent and complementary realities. And it is an answer that leads simultaneously in two diametrically opposite directions: forward to Christ, the Word in John's Gospel, and backwards to hell, to Canto 10, an X, towards Dante's very own poetic origins, and to his primo amico, the first friend, Guido Cavalcanti, one of the greatest poets of the 13th century. The story of Dante and Cavalcanti is one of a passionate friendship and strife. Hello, Italians. Dante dedicated his first serious poetic work, the Vita Nuova, to Cavalcanti. But that work also marked the beginning of their move away from each other, with Cavalcanti embracing a more irrational and terrestrial idea of love, while Dante is starting his pilgrimage toward an idealized love that transcends our mortal boundaries, a salvific force leading to God. To put it crudely and somehow reductively, Guido followed the teaching of Siger of Brabant, the guy that was dancing with Aquinas, whose work he had studied in Bologna with Dante. Cavalcanti embraced a philosophy of radical Aristotelianism, according to which love has nothing to do with the intellect, while Dante opened his horizon to a more syncretic ideas, where love and knowledge could coexist as a reflection of one and the same divine light. Love for Dante is precisely what forces us to think. Cavalcanti died tragically after being exiled from Florence for being the cause of some political and social unrest in the city. Dante, as a prior of the city at the time, had to sign the edict for his exile. Dante and Guido never saw each other again, and Dante had to live with the unbearable guilt of having exiled his friend without having the chance to ever ask for forgiveness. I would argue that bringing back the memory of Cavalcanti at this point of Paradiso, not through physical presence, but through poetry, is Dante's way of reconnecting with his friends and with his own past, to ask for forgiveness in the most noble sense of this gesture. While words and ideas of Cavalcanti resonate throughout the whole comedy, we meet Guido's name, or better, last name, for the first time in Canto 10 of Inferno, the circle of hell where the Epicureans are punished, who make the soul die with the body. It is a canto of eternal stasis, of emotional and intellectual isolation, in perfect asymmetry with Canto 10 of Paradise. This canto portrays a parody of the degeneration of a city torn apart by unreconcilable political and social interests, and is marked by caesuras, continuous interruptions, and ultimately the stigma of incommunicability. When Dante meets Guido's father, Cavalcanti, he cannot understand why is not his Guido. In Italian, Guido literally means guide. To guide the poet in his journey by reason of his high genius, altezza d'ingegno, as he had led him in early poetic experiments of the Dolce Stil Novo. Dante explains, "I come not of myself. He who waits yonder, whom perhaps your Guido had in disdain, is leading me through here." Within these words, Dante entombs his old friend in a verbal tense of no return, the passato remoto, egli ebbe, he had. The old man infers from the verb tense that his son is already dead, which is a terrible equivocation. And he answers to Dante, he had? Does he still not live? Does the sweet light not strike his eyes? While Cavalcanti is no longer present, his conversation with Dante lingers beyond his disappearance, as if somehow Guido remains suspended or forever petrified into the verbal tense. Canto 10 of Paradise is a way for Dante to go back and dig up that remote past, that passato remoto, allowing Guido to join him in the dance in the heaven of wisdom. The presence of the absence of Guido in Canto 10 of Paradise casts a new light on the final image of the canto, that erotic clock that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, composed by song and the circular dance of the eternal blessed souls. I'm going to read these verses in Italian because the translator didn't quite capture the crudity and sensuality of the language. Indi, come orologio che ne chiami, nell'ora che la sposa di Dio surge, a mattinar lo sposo perché l'ami, che l'una parte e l'altra tira e urge, tin tin sonando con sì dolce nota, che il ben disporto spirito d'amor turge, così io vido la gloriosa rota muoversi e render voce a voce in tempra, e in dolcezza che esser no può nota, se non colà dove gioir s'insempra. If one pays attention to the sounds of the final rhyming words, surge, urge, turge, surge, urge, making turgid, I think the sexual references are clear, even if the overall meaning remains obscure. In the language of these terzinas, Dante is consuming and eternalizing the marriage between the two great poetic dueling manifestos of the Dolce Stil Novo, his own Donne che avete intelletto d'amore ladies who have intelligence of love, mentioned in Purgatorio 24, and Guido Cavalcanti's Donna me prega, a lady asks me. I will leave to you the pleasure of finding all the correspondences in the poems, rather than pointing them out to you, because I'm out of time, but more importantly, because it's more fun that way. But I do want to mention a consequence of this marriage and of this reconciliation with Guido, and that is the realization that knowledge and love for Dante are never something definite. The encyclopedia, this idea of learning in circles, is never a closed system. We're always and continuously on a journey, thinking and rethinking the world, ourselves, and our relationship with the divine. I would like to close with this image of openness and with a thought to our colleague, Carrie Stickney. I joined the college in the era of Zoom, so I never met him in person. But judging from the constant sense of wonder that he conveyed in his Mino lecture on incommensurability, which is now stuff of legend, I think that he would have liked the idea of wisdom as a joyous communion between love and knowledge that Dante presented here. Thank you.
Carrie Stickney and I were friends, and sometimes things would get heated between the two of us. This would have been one of those times. With the nearly complete victory over thought in the 19th and 20th centuries by the variations of historicism offered by Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger, we moderns no longer have the ears to hear Dante sing in the way he would like us to hear him. This is due to our opinion, nay, our faith, that the great authors of the past, no matter how ingenious they were, must have been products of their time and place. So Dante was, of course, a Christian. To argue otherwise is to offend the pieties of both Dante's time and of our own. Thus, when some modern scholars read the words of Dante in his letter to his friend Congrand, they find it necessary to call into question the authenticity of the letter for apparently no good reason at all. Could this have something to do with the fact that Dante says in this letter that in his Divine Comedy, he writes not primarily as a poet or a prophet, but primarily as a philosopher? Dante also writes in this letter that through beautiful lies, through what he calls, quote, polysemous or allegorical writing, quote, he both conceals and reveals his own meaning and those truths of the intellect that he wishes to cultivate in others. The letter further goes on to insist that while a mere surface reading of the comedy is concerned, quote, with the state of souls after death, unquote, the truer, deeper meaning is concerned with man, with the human as such, in this world and in this life. This was all previously a matter of fact for enlightened thinkers such as the French writer Voltaire and the German philosopher Schelling, but also for the English poet Percy Shelley, who said the following in his Defense of Poetry, written in 1821. I'm going to quote some fragments from that. Shelley says, "The distorted notions of invisible things which Dante and his rival Milton have idealized are merely the mask and the mantle in which these great poets walk through eternity, enveloped and disguised." He goes on to say, "Shakespeare, Dante, and Milton are philosophers of the very loftiest power." And Shelley says, "Dante was the first awakener of entranced Europe. He created a language, in itself music and persuasion, out of a chaos of inharmonious barbarisms. He was the congregator of those great spirits who presided over the resurrection of learning, the Lucifer of that starry flock which in the 13th century shone forth from Republican Italy, as from a heaven into the darkness of the benighted world." And finally, and perhaps most striking, Shelley says, "The Divine Comedy and Paradise Lost have conferred upon modern mythology a systematic form, and when change and time shall have added one more superstition to the mass of those which have arisen and decayed upon the earth, commentators will be learnedly employed in elucidating the religion of ancestral Europe, only not utterly forgotten because it will have been stamped with the eternity of genius. So Shelley, in sum, thought more deeply than most about Dante and his relationship to Homer and the ancient pagan religion, that is, to the gods of antiquity. Shelley claims that Dante was one of the secret legislators of the human race, a race at that time in a state of pitiful, contemptible intellectual and moral ignorance. Dante, for Shelley, was someone responsible for the resurrection of republican government in Europe. And finally, for Shelley, Dante, along with Milton, will one day be understood as responsible for the beautiful memory of Christianity after the next religion or superstition has taken its place, and this despite the fact that Dante and Milton were not Christians at all. Different sorts of questions might arise for a reader of the Divine Comedy who has the courage to take this into serious consideration. Here are a few questions. As we begin to read the comedy, we encounter the likes of Minos, Pluto, Fortuna, Persephone, Hercules, and Apollo. Since Dante's gods and their offspring are presented in the comedy to be as equally real or true as the Christian God and his angels and devils, might not they all, Greek and Christian alike, be taken to be as unreal as one another? In Canto 26 of Inferno, we find that Ulysses has been consigned to hell by God, not by Dante, mind you, who never seconds this judgment made by God. The shameless Ulysses is depicted as having a burning desire for knowledge for its own sake, by one's own efforts, and at the expense of a homecoming to tradition and family. Such a desire is in no way seen as a transgression by Ulysses, but rather as a fulfillment of our natures, of our eros or amor, the same ancient daimon that, as John Cornell has shown us, Dante, our contemporary, sought to rehabilitate in light of its denunciation as sinful by the theologians of the Catholic Church. Ulysses speaks in this canto of his artful horse, the horse with its pious exterior that was used to penetrate the walls of Troy. Is the Divine Comedy Dante's own Trojan horse, pious on the outside, but really a great deceit used to penetrate the walls of the theology of his time? In Canto 15 of Purgatorio, within the terrace of wrath or anger, Dante has us focus on the apparently opposing virtues of meekness and forgiveness, as opposed to wrath and anger. Dante, the great psychologist, places his readers and their concern with virtue on the couch. He refers to Acts of the Apostles 7 verses 259. Stephen is stoned to death by the Jewish community while publicly pronouncing things that undermine the Jewish law and thus the very foundation of the Jewish way of life. As this, quote, war, takes place, Stephen prays to God, asking for forgiveness for his persecutors. Some kind of passion was at work in Gregory that was at odds with the law. Plato calls it thumos. This antinomian ressentiment in Gregory understandably arouses another thumatic desire for justice on the part of the Jews. Does Dante seek to reveal that the truth behind a call for meekness and forgiveness is a new way of waging war, another form of battle, most subtle power play on the part of the weak to defeat their enemies? What is the real passion behind turning one's other cheek? Dante highlights in Paradiso the criminal foundations of both the old and the new Rome. We become witnesses to a new Pax Romana of sorts, eventually the Crusades, including the mass slaughter of fellow Christians under the leadership of Fulcieri and St. Dominic. But before this, in Canto 6, we are offered an extended account of Emperor Justinian's understanding of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the genocide of the Jews living there. What one apparently has to accept as a believer is that the crucifixion of Christ is a punishment for Adam's fall from grace. And as punishment for the crucifixion, the Jews must suffer vengeance for the vengeance taken by God on his own Son. In Canto 14, we wonder whether Dante is asking whether we believe in the miracle of the resurrection of the body because of self-love, but more precisely because we take our bodies to be most our own, in contrast to what Aristotle teaches us when he argues that it is our intellects that are most our own. Aristotle himself would have to wonder what it means for human beings to desire their own death, to desire to be perfectly whole in a world beyond, over and against the good life we naturally seek in our own earthly paradise. In Canto 24, St. Peter examines Dante on his apparent beliefs. Through a series of circular arguments and plagiarized repetitions of the doctrines of others, the proof that serves to justify Dante's belief in what God tells us by means of written scripture are the miracles. Such miracles are the unnatural works of God that prove the substance or foundations of faith, miracles that must be true because scripture tells us they are. Dante's closing argument comes at lines 106 to 108. Quote, "Even if the world turned to Christianity, said I, without miracles, this one miracle is such that the others are not 1/100th of it. For you come into the field poor and hungry to sow the good plant, formerly a vine, but now become a thorn bush." Despite Dante's doctrinal claims about his belief in the miracle of the Trinity, we may ask what exactly is the one and only real miracle that survives his examination by Peter.
Okay, thank you all for coming back, and we're just going to open things up for questions at some point. We might redirect among ourselves, but please, we always do like to start with a student or two. Please. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. My question is the result of a failed essay attempt. The role of art in Purgatorio, there are different terraces, the different styles of art, how those change in relation to the lesson. We have ideas. I didn't, but
Wait, could you just say that last part? How they change in relation to
the moral lessons.
Oh,
each
oh,
era.
I mean, I guess one thing I would say is Dante begins Purgatorio by saying he's going to bring poetry to life, right? And so it seems like one thing that has to happen in order for art to change in Purgatorio is for him to have a different sense of what after, to sort of disaggregate death from writing, which I think are entwined in some way in hell, that maybe that's a possibility, that writing is just dead writing. It's just carved and left behind, and in some sense dead. And I think when you get the fuller description of what a soul is in Purgatorio, which Dante describes as air, moist air, like breath, like language, that's filled with light and given forma and adorno. Yes, form and adornment, forma and adorno. Suddenly you have this idea that, well, maybe that's what poetry is as well. Maybe that's mimesis, actually, that it's a living thing, that it's left behind, but it's not dead matter. It's actually something that is ensouled. And I think the way in which he stands in front of the Terrace of Pride and looks at art that's made by God. By the way, oh my God, why would God make art? Like, that's sort of insane. But has this kind of dynamic relation to it where he's looking all over and he can't focus on one spot. Like, that feels to me like living art all of a sudden, ensouled art. I think something does change. I think you're right about that.
And it changes the perspective too, right? He learns from Virgil that he has to look at the whole picture. He cannot look at parts. So I guess there is a moral change there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that Mr. Stickney?
Oh, boy. Yeah, this also comes from not a failed sophomore.
Not yet.
Oh! Thank you.
Jordan.
It's a question that led me to a senior essay and then ended up not being in the senior essay. The character of Ulysses appears in all three books, and Mr. Golluber mentioned something about Ulysses. When we first see him in Inferno, he's in the couch of the fraudulent counsel, his fate doesn't seem to be quite as bad as some of the other punishments. And then in Purgatorio, there's a reference to the difference, how he avoided the sirens versus Dante. But then in Paradiso, Dante sees him looking out and sees him, with his wild wings, trying to get to the island. The question I have is that there seems to be an inverted chronology. That Mr. Bleichmar, you mentioned that there's somewhat of a fairly understandable chronology to Dante's journey. But when we look at Ulysses, we see Ulysses first in death and in hell, and then later on we see him alive before his death. I just wonder about that aspect, what that might seem, perhaps in Mr. Golluber, this might be a suggestion that there's a possible redemption for Ulysses. Does that make sense, or does any of it make sense?
That makes complete sense to me. I see Ulysses as somehow the hero. He represents philosophy. He's going out to look at the world, to observe the souls of human beings. And I think that Dante is on his own Odyssean journey. He somehow is modeling himself as a character, as the pilgrim in the comedy. It's not a direct route. He's going to all these different ports, like Jason, the Argonaut, to figure out what's going on in men's souls. What kinds of gods do they believe in, and what does that say about them as human beings? So I think that you're right, that there's a redemption. I mean, you can see it there in the beginning, and it's sort of suggested by the virtuous pagans who he's already met. There's something about I want to be there with them. I want to be with those poets. I'm okay there. That's all. To get to talk to Homer, or to travel with Ulysses to the shores of Mount Purgatory. So I think you're absolutely right.
I also think it's interesting just that they're both paragons of lostness, right? Dante opens by saying, I woke up and I was lost, And in a way, that's also where we find Odysseus, deeply lost, in a bunch of different senses. So I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think it's, it's along those lines, a kinship.
I'm going to ask a little follow-up before we go. I just want to push on this a little bit. I understand your argument, Mr. Golluber, and I see a lot of it throughout the comedy, but just staying with Ulysses, there's certainly a way to read that canto where you see the same kind of self-justification, self-deception in Ulysses that you'd see with other sinners that are treated very sympathetically. I don't think that means that Dante's not a heretic in the way that you developed it, but it doesn't seem to me Ulysses comes through that treatment totally unscathed, or do you think he stands out for not getting a kind of critique comparable?
So what would that critique look like?
Deceiving his shipmates, sacrificing them recklessly, taking something on that is hubristic, that's going to fail, not recognizing his own limits. I mean, again, I'm working from the premise that I think is part of your argument, that he treats various pagans and sinners so sympathetically that it's hard to reinscribe it into Christian moral theology or something like that as primarily what's being depicted. But I just think there's a way of seeing Ulysses caught up in the same kind of beautiful, self-deceptive, self-justifying trap that Francesca is in, that other great sinners are in.
It reminds me a little bit of Stickney's point about people who had a chance to love and then maybe didn't, because the side of Ulysses that we see in the Odyssey is the warrior who learns to overcome the desire for continuous experience and then learns to come back home and to be with his wife and his son. And I remember actually in Mr. Cornell's study group, Carrie Stickney and I had an exchange where I was very drawn to the notion of experience. Like it seemed, to me that seemed like the most worthwhile thing to pursue. And I said, you know, if someone offered me the chance to go on a spaceship to Saturn or something once my kids went off to college, I would take it. And Carrie said that he absolutely would not, and that he thought the constant search for experience prevents you from a certain engagement with what's right before you. And I'm thinking of this in connection to the fact that he almost makes it to purgatory, but maybe he makes it the wrong way. Like he literally tries to get to purgatory as opposed to emotionally try to get to purgatory as a possibility of, I don't know. It reminded me of sort of characters who maybe there was some kind of love that wasn't accessible to them, or that they misprized for something else. And that might be a different kind of indictment than false counsel.
I think that there is a constant fascination, though, on the part of Dante for characters like Ulysses and Francesca. But I think it's a fascination that becomes a sort of meter for Dante. He constantly measures himself in respect to these characters. And it's not by chance that Ulysses and Francesca both, at least in language, are in paradise. But
Did you say they are in paradise?
yeah, because he uses Francesca's words to describe that kiss that brings the world into existence, and he plays a lot with the language of Francesca. And Ulysses is like painted all over purgatory, like with the metaphors of the boat, the mad flight. And finally, when Mr. George, when he sees Ulysses on this little atom of evil that is the world from far away, he sees him just about to cross Cadiz, right? Just about to cross through the column of Hercules, to the pillar of Hercules. So just about to transgress. And so that there's a sort of tension there that maybe cannot be reduced just to the idea Ulysses is redeemed or not. I think he lives in this tension, and he should stay there.
It's also interesting to me that it's almost as if Dante doesn't believe Homer that Odysseus did decide to go home. You know, that image in the Inferno is him sailing off, as you say, you know, trying literally to get to purgatory. But it's interesting to think about that too, that it's like, what would Odysseus be if he had no desire to go home? What kind of person would he be?
It's peculiar, though, because in the Odyssey twice we hear of Tiresias's the prophecy that he's going to pick up, leave, and go where no one even knows of the sea, and it's some sort of founding that's going to take place. So I don't see it as just a thirst for experience. I think of it as a desire for knowledge that you can actually do something with. And just as I think Odysseus is anticipated as creating some sort of founding of something new, I see Dante presenting himself in that way. There's a new kind of founding that Dante seeks, and it's going to require a lot of transgression. And who knows what the limits are.
I'm not sure that I saw that one first. I know there are a lot of hands up.
But I think that, I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think that he tells us then basically that maybe he and demons are made for the achievement of knowledge. And I wonder if that is basically telling them that they're made for something that they're not. It's not the fullness of their end.
Could you repeat the last part? They're made for something that they're not?
That they're not. Like, that their end is, he's telling them their end is something
someone restate? I didn't hear all of it.
That he's deceiving, he's telling his men that their end is knowledge, but maybe it's not. That's not their, do you mean not, that might be his goal, but not theirs, or do you mean that might not be the end, the perfection of human nature?
The human knowledge is not, the goal of human life is not just knowledge, but it's knowledge in a specific way, in a specific relationship to God.
I mean, perhaps Ulysses understands what we are by nature, and that most people fall short of that. And the most he can do, and this is from the beginning of the Odyssey, is he could try to save the lives of his men while he is seeking out suke. He's seeking out knowledge of soul. And maybe it's not the prettiest of pictures, but yes, he's using his men to help him achieve that. They don't understand that that the goal of human nature is this, not knowledge, but the pursuit of wisdom. They have their own temptations that he has to control and steer in the right direction for both his men and for himself. But I do think that for Dante, mind is what is central, is the central focus for him. And I think at the end, by the end of the comedy, you see that there might not be mind in paradise. It's desire and will, but it's not thinking through things. And one might even say that he did Virgil, Dante the author did Virgil a great favor by not allowing him to get all the way up there. Virgil wouldn't have liked it very much, perhaps.
Get some, yeah, and then.
My question is Alighieri the author forgive? If that's enough, we can leave it there, or add some background address.
Forgive?
Forgive.
Does Dante the author?
Yeah, okay, it sounds like some.
Yeah, a little more.
He seems to, I mean, he seemed to be very forgiving. He doesn't seem to think that people deserve certain suffering and anguish that they receive.
I think that's definitely true of the character. But I guess I'm wondering, on the one hand, it can't be Odysseus. It has to be Dante in a sense, because he's somehow a true father, or truly circumscribes storytelling in a way that Odysseus, even though he's a storyteller, cannot circumscribe his own story, cannot leave the physical realm, or imagine that there might be some other way to the story or something like that. So the collapsing, to some degree, of the author and the hero is necessary for the kind of work that Dante is doing. And it seems like that work is, on one hand, a way to sort of take this event, his exile, which seems like a damning, and to turn it into something that is no longer outside his control or outside his domain as an author. And it seems like, on the one hand, he's successful at that. But I also think that there's Shakespeare and Joyce also surmount their own surroundings to a degree, or regain control over something that they seem to be subject to. And forgiveness, I think, is essential to both of their reintegration with society, or to their understanding of how the author or the poet stands in society. And it's unclear to me whether Dante has the same relationship to forgiveness of those who have damned him, or if he just believes that he can leave them behind.
I worry, I love that you brought up the example of exile, Mr. Clymer, because that's such a topic that he wants to tell or think about in the context of paradise, with the kind of biblical idea of exile behind it. I worry, though, that the vision that you get there seems isolated to me in some sense. He wants to kind of reimagine exile and re-signify it in some way, but that doesn't feel to me the same as the forgiveness that you're imagining that that involves a kind of rejoining of the world. It feels to me more like a work of the imagination, like a solitary work that the artist does. But that's my initial thought.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Dante, he writes, is it in Paradiso, where he talks about how this book, the comedy, is going to get him back to Florence. But it doesn't look like he's going to forgive all these corrupt political figures and church figures. But he does want to offer them something. He wants to offer the world something. So I don't know if it's forgiveness. Maybe he's not capable of forgiveness for what they've done to him, but he is capable of great generosity. He wants to change the course of the world, and he wants to make it possible for all the bloodshed and the war between the different political parties, some connected to the Pope and some, interested in the empire, and he seems to be on the side of empire rather than the papacy. He wants to offer the world something, so I see generosity, but I think you're right. I don't know. I don't know if he thinks forgiveness is a necessary virtue, which strikes me as, I'd never thought about it before.
He's so angry.
Yeah.
He's so angry, which I think is really interesting. And I didn't, talked about the love side, but there's so many, there are these, one of the reasons the Inferno really fascinates me, there are these people like Francesca or, Brunetto Latini, who he loves so much, right? Like he seemed to be the first in the race, not the last. These people who Dante seems just delighted to see in Inferno and almost wants to absolve. And then there are the people that he clearly just wants, people 7 centuries later to hate with him, And that's, I agree that it's a really good question.
There's also cruelty. Beyond. Either you take the argument that every sinner in hell is psychologically just chastising himself or herself, which I think was suggested, and so that nothing is doing it to them. But I just think Dante's, that's where I said that I'm not sure that the vividness of his imagination is always salutary, because I think it's very hard to deny that part of the exercise of the comedy is to torture in his mind the people that he thinks deserve it. And I don't know what to do about that other than to, I'm reminded of Mr. Cornell's words as cited by Mr. Sterling, that maybe he's the first great poet of the unconscious, and there's a lot in the unconscious that's cruel and that's punishing and that imaginatively revels in it. Then we can try to sort of contain it and curb it and sanitize it, and I did so myself. But basically by talking about hell as like an empty theater, with nothing happening. So I don't know. I think the question of cruelty is hard to avoid.
He gives us very close to the end of the Inferno this image, which we talked about in our seminar, of the Sicilian bull, right? Which is this torture device that's meant to look like a golden bull, and people are put inside of it, and when they scream as they're being burned to death, it like some kind of sadistic kazoo comes out as the sort of like the bellowing of a bull. But like there is, I think, some way in which Dante is wondering if what he's doing is something similar to this Sicilian bull. Like I think that is actually a real.
But it's in the imagination, though. It's different.
It is.
Dante would not.
No. Rather that there might be a kind of the artist's impulse to represent pain is in some sense to participate in what is painful.
And to be honest about what it means to be human and not reject it. And he may consider that what Christianity holds as our ideal dehumanizes us.
That's right.
It's not honest about what we are by nature.
Right here.
I'm curious about the role of Beatrice. I am going to talk about a lot in each of the talks. But, so I'm thinking of 2 parts, perhaps, and perhaps maybe Beatrice as an allegory or as the role of the comedy. So in Canto 30 of Paradiso, he has this long segment, and he goes through this
sort of motif several times where Beatrice is way too beautiful and blinding. Can't stand looking at her. But in this, he says she's the most beautiful, and then he goes on these stanzas where he says the theme of his poem has now beaten him. He's like a painter who has to put away his brushes, and this is Canto 30, so about 3 cantos before Paradiso comes to an end. And then in Purgatorio, he's in one of the circles, and I can't remember which one, but he runs into a fellow poet who asks him about the new style of Dante's poetry, and he says, "I've heard it's about love at the core of it." And he says, "I guess it is that. He's like, everything love is dictating everything I'm writing." And that poet goes on to say, "Well, if we were to compare our two, it'd be the same, except yours has love at the core." But I guess I'm curious, what is the connection between these two things? Love is supposed to be at the core of the comedy, and Beatrice, the character, is the theme of the comedy, but so much of it is about faith and virtue. And it seems like, in a way, my question would be, is this somehow like using love to investigate the divine or the eternal? Or is this somehow using the divine and the eternal as an allegory simply to uncover love?
That's a great question. Beatrice is a
Why didn't anyone talk about Beatrice?
I know.
Yeah.
You've kind of shamed us. Like,
Well-
we definitely should have talked about Beatrice.
My original thought of presenting was I was going to talk about the exquisite striptease that Beatrice. No, she becomes. No, I mean, at first she's cruel to him, right, and then she becomes kind to him, and then she becomes more and more beautiful as she takes off every vow, and it, as Dante's creation. She somehow serves as a guide to lead him into more and more doubt about what he's confronting. So we hear in the Convivio that Dante, after he got over Beatrice in the Divine Comedy blames him, says, you abandoned me for another woman. But it turns out that woman was Lady Philosophy. And I think Beatrice finally in the end represents Eros, or love of wisdom, and then she is his guide, and she keeps, as she reveals herself, much more is revealed about the appearances of what he's being confronted with.
But Beatrice is also mystifying, right?
Yeah.
I seem to remember another anecdote. I think it was Borges, who was reflecting about the first encounter with Dante and Beatrice in Canto 30 of the Purgatory. And Borges said, well, if it was me, with that reception, I'm going back to hell. But aside from our modern sort of conception of the woman in general that Beatrice turns out to be, she seems to be a pivotal, very important character for Dante. Actually, no, she seems to be, she is. Dante devotes the whole Vita Nuova to the celebration, to the laudatio of Beatrice. And she was also the main point of contention about love between Cavalcanti and Dante. Cavalcanti thought that love was an Aristotelian accident. It could not be ever personified in Beatrice, while Dante basically constructed his whole poetic and his whole itinerarium mentis in deum around Beatrice. Although she dumps her, Canto 30 of Paradiso for Bernard Clairvaux. I don't know. It's choices, right?
Okay. This is going to be too simple of an answer, but I was really struck when Mr. Bleichmar was saying walking on hills, even if it's an allegory, resembles walking on hills in real life. And I was thinking, yeah, that's one of the things that I really love about Dante is that his loyalty to the actual sensual, physical world, right? Which is what I think, in a way, a poet should be most loyal to. And, at the same time, he's able to describe to us flight or the earth seen from above. I mean, his toolbox is pretty stunning, but I guess part of me thinks like he wants to go as far as he possibly can into these realms of wisdom, knowledge, imagination, love, perfection, you know, but he's going to anchor that in like a living, breathing person that he actually saw, that he had a kind of fleshly connection to, even if then it transforms into an incomprehensible meeting in the beyond.
This is not an answer to your question, but I was just thinking about Ms. Villa's comment about the moment when Beatrice disappears and we get Bernard instead. And it's such a funny moment in the text where he turns around and he's expecting to gaze upon her. And he says, like, and then there was this old man there. But it has to be a moment of heartbreak in some sense, but it's rendered as laughter and comedy. And I feel like there's another moment where you'll remember, but someone is described as going to Paradiso and realizing that everything they believed on earth was wrong. And then they laugh at their mistake. Gregory, right. But it seems like Beatrice is still playing a really important function there in showing us that that kind of error and disappointment is being transmuted into something like laughter and comedy at this level of paradise.
This also will not be an answer. But one way I'm trying to think about it is through the idea of marital love, for instance. Like, because to me, Beatrice always seems like a first crush. Like that sort of almost inability to look someone in the eye, and the sense of being exposed, deeply, deeply, just by someone realizing that you're looking at them. And then I think of Cato at the beginning of Purgatory, and Virgil is like, look, I can ask your wife, to pray for you. And he's like, my wife means nothing to me. I'm in Purgatory. So I don't know what kind of understanding Dante has of, I think of him primarily as celibate, but he talks about marriages a little bit. But to me, Beatrice is going back to a very early experience of love. I don't know, it always feels to me like an adolescent experience of love. And I don't know what to do with that in terms of whether it's, philosophical love, but it's got that intensity that then maybe only exists at that very strange period of life. I thought you're posing the question as what is used to investigate what is really wonderful, but that may require more thought. Anyway, but it just seems like a kind of regression to the earliest, adolescent beginning of erotic love to me.
Yeah, he was 9 and she was 8 when they first encountered one another.
Even younger.
Even for Italian, that's...
I think, have you had your hand up for a while? Okay, then we'll move back around. Sorry, a lot of hands.
First of all, thank you, that was a wonderful panel. In the Graduate Institute, we don't have the opportunity to read the comedies, and because I have not read the comedy, my question will be sort of intolerably vague. Sorry. But while listening to the talks, sort of common thread that was emerging there is paradox. Whether it was the paradox of the tension between piety and heresy, or love and punishment, or allegory and mimesis, or even sort of closed semiotics of punishment and the open gate of hell. And then hearing the talk about Ulysses and Beatrice, it feels like there's just paradox on paradox on paradox. So it's just very sort of, is there something fundamental about these poetics that paradox plays a role, or do you just think what the role of paradox is in poetics?
So I feel like you were, I do think a lot of people were talking about that, but in a way that is right on what I thought you were trying to do.
Right. Well, paradox is a very interesting instrument of thought. Right? It somehow forces you to think outside of the box, because within the box it creates an unreconcilable contrast. So in that sense, I think Dante sees paradox or even the chiasmos like something that keeps together contraries. For Dante, I think contrarias will always complement us. So he always sees these double double-edged face of reality. That's why I always hesitate to pin down Dante, because he's too hard to frame. He's a heretic, yes. He's a Christian, yes. I mean, his biographer, his first biographer, said that he was obsessed by lust, and yet he brings us the most sterilized version of Beatrice possible, with some escape, some erotic scene. But yeah, it's. I think really for Dante, the paradox is a way of thinking, and it might be even reflected in the poetic structure that he chose to frame his comedy in. So the terzina incatenata. So it's called incatenata because it's chained, but at the same time it's one of the most open structures that he could possibly choose, because it never closes the circle, right? It's A, B, A, B, C, B. So it keeps escaping, right? Its own closure. And it's interesting because he must have thought a lot about this particular structure, because, for example, in the Vita Nuova, he uses the sonetto. The sonetto is similar to the terzina, but it's closed. So it's not a structure that allows you to think as Dante wanted to think.
In Paradise, he also, I'm trying to connect the question of paradox to the question of ineffability that you brought up. Because in Paradise, he's trying to describe things that he says cannot be described. It's not exactly a paradox in that kind of airtight, self-contradicting. But there's almost at some point, there's almost like a topological paradox where he says he's thinking about Beatrice, and then he says that she's the one who imparadises his mind. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like the mind is holding something inside it that then is imparadising it, so as to hold it from the outside. And there's many moments like that, and I always feel like the way he slips out of the paradox is through doing something with language, like inventing a word like she imparadizes my mind. And somehow you're no longer in the paradox, but you produced it. And I don't know, there's something about his work as a poet in resolving these impossible to describe things through a word or a phrase. I don't know.
I'm wondering.
No, go ahead.
I'm wondering though, are there different kinds of paradoxes for Dante? There are those that encourage thought, that promote thinking, but are there also paradoxes that make it, that put thinking at a dead end, such as, he mentions Aristotle all over the place, and Aristotle has a teaching about informed nature, and there is nature, and there's things that, there's the law of non-contradiction, but here with Christianity we have human and divine natures as one. And what does he make of that paradox? Does he think that that's a dead end, that doesn't help us to think about who we really are, or does it help us? I don't know what to do with it.
I've sometimes thought, I haven't yet decided whether I think he's a believer or not, but I've sometimes thought that his attraction to Christianity is because Christianity itself is so full of paradoxes in exactly the way that you're saying, and so that, it's like as a poet, he thinks, ooh, this is this tool that I want to use. This is this aesthetically incredibly powerful thing. Christianity is its home right now, and so I guess my instinct is to say he doesn't think that's a dead end of thought. I don't know that he thinks it leads to a Christian worldview, but I think he thinks, this is a funny image, but I feel like it's like the feeling of pressing two really strong magnets at their wrong poles, And there's something satisfying, it's invisible, that force, but you feel its existence. And I sometimes feel when I'm reading Dante, that feeling when he gets you in a really tight spot. You know, I don't know how to get out of it, but I think, oh yeah, you know, something's being revealed, something invisible is being revealed.
I was thinking about what you said, Mr. Bleichmar, Guillermo, sorry, I'm going to use name. When he constructs neologisms like sim paradisa, similla, sadua, are always words that somehow turn on themselves. So almost words in conversation with that Latin meaning of conversation, so turning on themselves. So it's beautiful, it's interesting. I never thought about it before.
But you mean that all our lives we've been presented with a paradox that actually, and then Dante is saying, forget it. Is that sort of like that a paradox that would constrain you or chastise you or make you feel inadequate, and that he's saying it's not a paradox, it's false. Was that the sense?
That was the sense, yeah, and that's when I mentioned, when I quoted the part about the miracles at the end, that, you know, the real miracle is that so many people believe this. How is that possible? That's the unnatural.
But it seems like another angle on this could be that he sees the human being and the human soul as containing paradoxes, tensions, contraries, that both philosophy and, at least, say, Christian theology try to resolve or distill out in ways that are not the full human experience. And it seems like his poetic enterprise could be a third way between at least a certain kind of Christianity and some kind of aspiration of reason to distill those tensions into something artificially rational or lucid. I give up.
Hand up for a long time.
If somebody wants to claim they had their hand up for a long time. Oh, back there. Go ahead, Mr. Porter, and then back there, and then maybe
That's right.
I'm thinking of the redemptive quality that poetry plays. So even thinking of the author, Dante, this is characters, thinking of pubescent love and its elevation, thinking of topological potentiation as like realized through poetry. So if we think about the material world or the rational as something that's limiting, and even that we see something in Odysseus repeating, these same kind of motifs, even in different locations, and maybe a further realization along the topological idea of the rational or the material world. I guess I just want to think about the linguistic function that poetry is playing, and if we're not necessarily thinking of the moral implications of forgiveness, but as poetry as a reimagination of one's corporeal livelihood, life, decisions, and all these things. And so poetry, maybe it has a function in Dante as the function of the poet, is somehow showing us that, maybe mankind is limited by their rational decisions and their material conditions, but poetry allows an access to reimagine kind of one's moral limitations or something like that. And so I just, want to kind of like maybe open it up in that way of like, what is Dante showing that poetry can achieve, which the paradoxes, which are purely rational paradoxes, I'm even thinking of something like Dante, the author, is a world builder. And this kind of came up in our seminars on Benito Sereno, as well as, it comes up in Don Quixote as well. Kind of these irrational characters, but larger than life, that are in a way also reimagining the world for the people around them and allowing them to also enter into that kind of paradise, which poetry seems to, poetry as like an artistic technique, that opens up kind of like the rational techniques into something more as wisdom.
Sounds like someone's been reading Blake.
Who says art is true Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. This is perverse, but I almost want to respond to the question by pointing out something that Dante does, which feels like the opposite of that kind of transcendence in poetry, which is often, especially in Purgatorio, he'll give us a simile that actually pulls us out of the kind of world-building mythological landscape and puts us squarely in some kind of very realist landscape. And I'm thinking of particularly the moment where he has these P's that have been carved on his forehead. And he gives us this simile where he says, it's like someone walking around the street with a smudge on their face, and they don't know it, but they realize it by everyone else looking at them. And it's like, first of all, that's barely even a simile. Like, that is kind of the situation that he's in. But secondly, it sucks the metaphysics out of the air, and it gives us something that feels like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, or something like just like a guy on the street with a smudge of dirt on his face. And so I spent a lot of time puzzling about what's that doing there. And it's not the same as the kind of, I guess, quotidian but epic similes that you get in Inferno, where he talks about a kind of peasant in the snow who's concerned. But like that feels like a kind of pastoral simile that still affirms man's connection to the kind of cosmos and nature. This is something different than that. It feels like it's just trying to make visible some part of your daily experience. And it feels like poetry done in reverse. It's not taking something ordinary and transcending. It's like starting up here, and then it's funneling it down to your daily experience. And to me, that was one of the more astonishing parts of Purgatorio, one of the more unexpected parts of the project.
I'm sorry, back there, and we'll come up to you.
Going back to Beatrice, I was wondering, like something else, something in what Mr. Denver wrote and then what you wrote with Chapman, Dante laughs when Beatrice disappears, right? He turns to her and is a laughter.
I think we laugh is what I was trying to say, because the line is just so abrupt. He turns around and then I saw this old man, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought it was funny. So that's.
I'm just wondering about, I think it started in Purgatory too, when Dante first sees Beatrice, and then Beatrice returns to the poets that he's been with, Statius and Virgil, and sees that they're not there anymore and sobs. He's just crying, so I was wondering about getting any thoughts on the difference between sort of the disappearance of those poets and the disappearance of Beatrice and that one of them, it's very clear that Dante is so tragic when he turns and they're not there anymore. It's just that. And I remember feeling how sad it was. Like, although it's funny that Baron is there, it's very sad that he's gone. But I don't know where how that, it's not really clear to me how Dante feels when she's gone.
Yeah, the first disappearance, when Virgil disappears, Dante was trying to get it's almost like a moment where Dante's trying to get approval from his master, from his guide, because he uses the verses that Virgil used in order to describe Dido in love with Aeneas, and said, "Riconosco I segni dell'antica fiamma," I recognize the signs of the ancient flame. Almost like thinking, see, Virgil, I am now like bringing Beatrice within your own orbit, and Virgil is not there. So there is almost a sort of estrangement in Dante and a sort of realization that now he's in the role of the little child that lost his poetic guide and acquired this sort of mother, lover, general that is going to tell him to toe the line. So it's a strange scene of loss of a certain complicity with his master and Virgil's poetry,
and a sort of new role that Dante is seeking with Beatrice, that Dante is still unsure about. You know, how am I going to? He's terrified because he doesn't know how to react to Beatrice's admonishments. So.
It's interesting that Virgil and Beatrice don't get to, because often there's scenes of triangulation where, for instance, when Dante and Virgil meet Francesca, Francesca says something about how sad it is to remember happy times in wretchedness, and then she says, and he knows what I'm talking about. And so there's this sort of like, one person can enter into another person's viewpoint, and there's a third person watching that happen. And so there's a kind of rich dynamic there. The Beatrice and Virgil, I mean, I was also thinking like your friends don't like your girlfriend, or your, you know, but in a more serious way, where internally maybe you have these images or these figures inside you that are always speaking to you and are always, you know, mediating, and you know, your parents, friends, the people who stay inside you as sort of presences. And maybe since we were talking about paradox, there's a chance that they don't get along, or they don't, that you have to relinquish one to give to reach another or something.
Did you had your hand up? I know you first.
I'm curious about what it means to actually be suitable to see the stars, because I'm reading this now in a kind of psychological or unconscious vein. And so, is it that the stars are actually contained within Dante? As if like he is some kind of celestial sphere, or is he more of the earth? Because I think as he ascends, especially when we reach Paradiso, Beatrice tells him to keep his mind open. And so I wonder if those are purely external things, or if it is a psychological word. Are the stars things that he has within, but that he can't necessarily access within himself, or are they things that necessarily have to come from without, instead of something that is to be gained from within?
I love that question, and I'm sort of just going to add one of my own questions to it, and maybe these other people will answer both of our questions. But I was thinking about that line that Mr. Bleichmar read about the sun really early on. I forget what it says, but it's like the sun, I don't know, organizes everything, shines on everything. I don't know. It sounds to me almost like you know, Book 7 in the Republic, right? That the sun is going to guide everything and make everything, and so in a way, I find myself surprised that it's then the stars that occupy this major role in the book. You know, they end the book, they're in that beautiful place, you know, issue forth and see the stars again. I mean, so one thought I have just as a very bare beginning is like, well, the stars are a multiplicity, and they're all doing their own movements, very different than thinking about the sun, this one body of light. But I don't know what to make of that in terms of thinking about Dante.
Your question is interesting because the stars are, in a way, the most truthful thing that we can possibly see. They've been our compass for millennia. Right? But at the same time, there are the most untruthful experiences, because the stars are not really organized in constellations. We want to see them like that in order to make order, but we want to see them like that also because the stars allow us to tell stories. I mean, mythology, right, is all about the stories of the star. The moon, for example, in Dante is the storytelling planet, right? It's the planet of grammar. So in a sense, it is true, the stars are in Dante, and outside of Dante, they are, in a sense, a way in which Dante orients himself, like at the beginning of Paradiso, dolce color d'oriental zaffiro, that's like the first way he describes the sky, with that orienting. But they're also inside him. They're a way in which he connects with narrative, with storytelling.
I don't know if I heard everything that you said on. Are you suggesting that we impose order, or that the stars show us that there is order? Because
that we see the stars in certain patterns, right? And we call them Cassiopeia, we call them Libra, we call them, I don't know, with the names of mythology. And in that rearrangement and in that naming, I think that we are investing the stars in a sort of role that allows us to tell stories.
But it also allows to see that there is rational order in the universe. Even though there's a way in the poetry, we make something which it both conceals and reveals what's really going on, and there is this true order, even though we see it in a way that is a very human perspective. I'm wondering if that's what he makes of the power of poetry to, as in Hesiod, you tell lies like the truth. There's a way in which that imposition allows you access to to nature.
I also think it's cool, this is once again not all that helpful, but that it's rivedere, see again the stars when he comes out, which echoes to me the beginning, of the Inferno. I re-found myself, so I don't know, and that even seems related to that conversation, these turning words that he invents, but somehow it's a return to the stars.
Just to add to that, I'm just thinking about the way it ends each of the three parts. So we return to see the stars again. We go out to see the stars again. We're something like, we're prepared to rise up to the stars at the end of Purgatory. And each of those times it is Le Stelle, but then at the end of Paradiso, it's the love that moves the sun and the other stars. I'm just thinking about that sequence. I don't know where it goes, but somehow in the last reference, we're talking about what moves the stars in a way that the others, it's either we're seeing them or we're ascending to them. And that seems like a shift. And the fact that it becomes the sun and the other stars. So I don't know whether that takes it inside or outside, but it seems to me it shifts it from something like the planetarium to some other relationship to them. Back there. Yeah, that's you. Yes.
My question is about the use of the classical thought and gods and philosophy. And as a developer in his talk said that this is sort of using classical images and gods alongside Christian things points to him saying that Christian gods are just as unreal as these. But when I read it, especially after Aquinas who dropped so much Aristotle, I read it as sort of in that vein, in that it's real, like Catholicity, and that there are
I said that, but I also think you're right that what Dante is not just about the politics around him, it's not just about this particular religion, it's about the human as such. And it's comprehensive in that regard. And I think that's part of a tradition of epic poetry, Homer, Virgil, that they're all doing the same sort of thing. By means of a particular time and place, they can try to attempt to explore what is universal about human nature in their particular ways. So I agree with you.
So I have two questions, but the first one is very specific, so I promise it won't take very long. The first is to Mr. Bleichmar. When reading Victoria, I was startled by what seemed to be the Southern Cross, which of course would have been kind of an anniversary, I would think. And I wondered if he might have somehow had access to like even Batutta's travels, or if it was Marco Polo, or if it was just because like coincidence, because there's a lot of crossing to read Victoria. But I wondered if you have theories on that.
No idea. I mean, we could just go read some of the commentaries and find out probably, but I don't know myself.
But I imagine that, I think we all agree that Dante was a genius, and he read everything there was to read that was accessible to him.
But wasn't there a part of this guy that was just completely unknown to? I mean, I find that exciting that there was he knew because of his sense of the world that there must be stars that we're not seeing. I mean, in a way, it's sort of returning us to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like the thought that. I hope that there were some stars that no one knew in Europe, and that he was able to think like, oh, well, I wonder what those are like. And, but I don't know if they really resemble the Southern Cross or not. That's not enough of a clear picture in my head.
That makes sense. My best guess would have been Batuta, because I know you guys don't kill while around Madagascar, but I didn't know if Dante would have access to his travels. But the other question is, when reading the Divine Comedy, I feel like there are multiple presences in the text. Like, there's the obvious first one of Dante the Pilgrim, of the character who travels through hell, through purgatory, through paradise. And then there's the secondary presence of Dante the poet, like, who retrospectively, truthfully retrospectively, like, writes about the travels of himself in the past. But then I wonder if there might be a third perspective as well, or a third person, a third Dante, like Dante the author, who is set in front of Dante the Pilgrim and Dante the poet, in that there are just some dissonances and some tensions that I feel in the text, and I wonder if they might be intentional by Dante the author, not Dante the poet, not as a persona that he adopts in an artful way to present himself as, retrospectively looking back at his travels through the divine realms, but as the Dante, the historical figure who is writing this work to present us with some ideas about how to live life. And I wonder if this gulf seemed apparent to any of you, or if there are any places where this dissonance or tension cropped up. I think Mr. Golluber was kind of touching on it via Shelley, talking about how he seemed to dismantle poetry for philosophy's sake, but I wonder if there might be other ways that you guys felt that.
Is part of your question is, does Dante think of himself primarily as a poet, or does he think that poetry is in the service of philosophy? That both.
It's also about the authorial intent. It's about it feels to me like there might be a difference between the persona that Dante adopts, the poet that in the work, in the universe created by the work, is writing about the past, is writing about his experiences. Who is distinct from the character of Dante as he travels through hell? I wonder if there's a difference between this poet who exists in the words, in this work, and the Dante who actually wrote the work in the real world.
You mean something like an unreliable narrator?
An unreliable narrator, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting.
Do you have an example in mind of when you felt that tension?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably what I'm going to say on
Then we can't say
one thing that consistently strikes me is the presence of wrath in the Divine Comedy, and how though Dante consistently acknowledges and addresses his participation in the other sins, he largely ignores his own wrath. And throughout hell, he is consistently extremely wrathful toward the denizens of hell, throughout Purgatorio, he briefly goes through the wrathful circle, but he doesn't really seem to engage with it in any very meaningful way. Whereas, he talks about his own pride, and he seems to make note of it. He very clearly says he needs to address it. And I wonder if this might be a note on the part of Dante the author, not Dante the poet, who is clearly unaware of his own wrath, but the author who is writing the poet in such a way that this lack of awareness might be meaningful to the readers, maybe indicating that despite going through heaven, hell, and purgatory, this man may have a shortcoming that will land him in hell, which is just part of the human condition of not being able to assess ourselves objectively in a divine manner. That is one of the things that are just out of there.
I mean, it reminds me a little bit of that first question that I don't think we did a very good job of answering about the art in Purgatory. And I realize this isn't really what you're talking about in a way, but it seems like maybe a place where one Dante is making that art for another Dante to see and for us to see. I read a little short Jacob Klein article once about how that terrace where everybody's weighed down, I think that's Pride, yeah, we mentioned it, that actually even Dante can't really see the art, only we can. Only the reader can actually see the art well because everybody else is bent over. And I don't know, yeah, maybe that's sort of along the lines of what you're talking about. I think it's an interesting thought.
I mean, there is, in that scene, there's this sort of funny phenomenon where we get this description, panel by panel, of this triptych, which is all about humility. Mm-hmm. And one of the triptychs is David dancing in front of the ark, and his wife, whose name escapes me. Mikhail, right, is staring out sort of angry at him for exposing himself. And then Dante, after having this sort of experience of ekphrasis, turns to the prideful who are bent over, and he has no relationship to them. He doesn't see anything. He doesn't have any kind of empathetic response, or doesn't see himself in them. And it seems like actually the character that he is the wife looking out the window and sort of with arms crossed. And there's some way in which that feels like a really pivotal misreading. And I think you're right. There's a kind of, I mean, it feels like sort of vestigial irony from Inferno or something, but like there's a separation there where he hasn't quite learned the lesson you expect.
Your use of the term irony, I was thinking that one risk of reading for the unreliable narrator is that you start multiplying unveilings of irony, and that detaches you more and more, say, from the feeling that's animating. So the very end of the comedy is very strange, right? He sort of passes out, and it's almost like in cartoons when like the birds are still circling around the head of someone who gets knocked on the head. And he's, what are I don't have the book with me, but what is it? It's like things are set in motion by the end of the poem. And that to me seems like the idea is that poetry will set you in motion. And so that instead of like multiplying, vistas of irony, or like, oh, he thinks this, but then he knows, and I know because I'm looking behind all of them. That instead you could have a sense that what poetry should do is collapse that distance and set something in motion internally. And I do think there's a risk about the trope of the unreliable narrator, although it's very seductive and often, we just did Benito Sereno in seminar, and you can't help but think in those terms. But does that make sense that it may be preventing you from a very different idea of what literature should be doing, which is to collapse that distance and to act almost like the way that Ms. Chapman was describing the sense of touch as acting directly on you or something.
Mr. Burns.
And then we'll come over.
He's so well camouflaged.
Yeah, we can. They're first.
Okay.
And yet there's a knowledge of all good. And so I guess
So that scene, I want to find it, mirrors almost perfectly the beginning of the Commedia, the Inferno. What was Canto 28. So before getting to those two rivers, Dante says, "My slow step had now transported me so deep into the ancient wood that I could not see back where I had entered it." Clear reference to the beginning, like he finds himself in the Foresta Oscura and he didn't know how he got there. When all further progress was halted by a stream whose little wave was bending leftward the blades of grass that grew on its bank. And then, so these streams as three little waves, and Dante just very, almost seemingly without effort, crosses it, while we should remember the effort of not being able to face the three beasts, right, at the beginning of the canto. So I feel that this image, when we first see this river, is a sort of real new beginning for Dante. He finally comes to the consciousness of having, in a sense, surpassed that mountain. He actually climbed the mountain now. So the mountain that he saw in the beginning, he did climb. And so I find it as a very interesting moment. And about the significance of the two rivers, maybe somebody else can.
Of the two rivers.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to explore this a bit in seminar, and we didn't get very far, but it has, for me, it has something to do with the exploration of the possibility of knowledge without sin. Innocence and knowledge can somehow be combined in a way that they can't be if you think of human beings as fallen. All right, so it's a shame. You only have knowledge with shame, according to the biblical point of view. But I wonder if he's pointing to another alternative. You don't have to think of ourselves as sinful or to try to attain knowledge of the good.
I wonder too, I'm just thinking back to when we were talking about the cruelty of his imagination, and you were saying, you know, he's willing to look at all the parts of being human. And if I think of that kind of poet of the unconscious thinking, it seems like on the one hand, in order to truly be ourselves, we have to be willing to look at, you know, the dark parts inside and the cruel parts and the angry parts. But maybe there are going to be moments in which we need to forget that as well. You know, I mean, there's something really, I guess, attractive to me about this water that is going to cause the forgetting of some of that pain and cruelty.
Okay, so Mr. Golluber, I don't remember fully the last statement in our discussion, but the word that really resonated, and also just that stood out was the word Trinity. And so based on the conversation, taking the qualities in purgatory and paradise
Definitely a lot. Maybe somebody can take a part of it.
A third of
I
it.
feel like it touches for me at least, it's a question of, well, what does it mean to be a philosopher?
What does it mean to be?
What does it mean to be a philosopher? When the knowledge and the mind. But I did these processes in some way.
Can we maybe take the Trinity? Because I find the Trinity almost oddly, it's like I can't have any ideas about it because I'm so familiar with it and it seems so, I don't know, it's hard to even, for me to even become interested in it. I don't know how to describe it. It's like so canonical and strange that it's, I don't have any original thoughts about it, but I thought Ms. Villa was suggesting that the rhyme has a Trinity in it, that, and in fact, I've heard the story, I don't know if it's true, that Dante had a dream before he wrote the comedy where all the words, all the rhymes in Italian came to him as like girls in groups of three. And so they were like, we're here for you, we're here for the poem. But it just seems that the Trinity as a notion for me is very difficult to think about, but the Trinity as a braiding that makes up the whole poem, to me seems closer to his sense of what matters, which is the structure of the reality of the poem is interwoven of terza rima. And maybe that, I don't know, I'll offer that as one angle on the question of the Trinity, not a theological one.
Yeah. I don't know about the three cantiche, so I don't know about the collapsing of Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise into the Trinity. But there is for sure a relationship, for example, between the Trinity and love, and this relationship is engendered in the very figure of Beatrice. Beatrice, her name means 3 times graced, right? Tre volte beata, Beatrice. And in Vita Nuova, Dante explains that he firmly believes in this idea that nomina sunt consequentia rerum, so that the name should show something about the essence of what is spoken. So, in a sense, I like this idea of interweaving, but I also like this idea of a continuous exchange of looks and gazes, like the Trinity as a function of love, as an idea of continuous give and take. And it seems that, in a sense, the Trinity should be a fixed idea, right? God, the first immovable mover. But for Dante, it's a very dynamic structure. So I like this idea of a continuous relationship, interweaving of planes between the 3 figures of the Trinity. And about your connection with philosophy, well, a hint about the connection between philosophy and the Trinity might come from the fact that the first time that the Trinity is introduced is in the Heaven of Wisdom. So I fear that I cannot go further than that because I don't have a clear idea why Dante introduces the Trinity right there.
Sorry.
Sorry. Go.
I mean, that's kind of where he has to start from, but the question for me is, how do you think about the fundamental question of the two, informed matter? He's really reflecting on Aristotle, and so what is being? What is the relation? So how do you think about that problem in the context of 2, in the context of 3? How do you? And I don't know how to connect this exactly, but there, you know, I think it's right to think about the Dianima quite a bit. And for Aristotle, it's informed matter. You can't separate them. And we are thinking bodies. I mean, touch is a great example of this. It's a judgment. We put things together that we. So there's a way in which Aristotle can't separate mind from body. It's a false distinction, and I think that's a beginning for the way the philosopher thinks about the world. But that's the best I can do.
Yeah, and I wanted also to share that when we think of the star, it's made up of two triangles set down. So the forms the five, and which the pagans use, then so yeah, that's what I'm just connecting.
You've had your hand up for such a long time, for such a long time.
Yeah, sorry, we had a big comeback. We'll go there.
I'll give you guys a little choose your own adventure. Really, just name first person names, which question sounds more interesting. Either optics or homecoming. And I'll elaborate on it.
I love homecoming.
Homecoming.
Me too.
I would have gone with optics, but that's a good one too. This is a question that remains after our last seminar. And I do see this as kind of like a chance to hopefully like get your true perspective on this, Ms. Villa, but the whole thing, pointing towards Ulysses, he is someone who failed to go home. And that seems to be his problem according to Dante, or that by virtue of which he ends up in hell next to some nobody. But it's funny because for Dante himself, this was kind of touched on in the seminar, it's not very clear to me what it is he has to go home to. The hell is full of people from Florence. And there's a lot of good people from Florence and heaven as well, but they're all dead. Presumably not there in Florence anymore. And so this is also a very, I feel like a cliche question, so I have to be forgiving me for this, but the ending feels like such a cliffhanger in the sense it's like, wouldn't it be nice to stay here and further probe into this final image of the experience? I can kind of see man in this final representation of God. I see something there, I can't make it out, but he does have to go back, and it's not clear to me why Dante does not elaborate on his fulfilling of this circle and coming back home. Because, along the whole way, people are telling him they should write this down, you spread this with everyone down below. And we don't get any kind of poetic experience of the force of that mission. And in that sense, it feels incomplete in a way. It feels like we might be tempted to follow in the path of Ulysses. And I'm just wondering what you guys made of the ending and the lack of having gone.
So where is the ending? That's the first question. The second idea is that I thought a lot about this, especially after our seminar, where we thought about poetry as a sort of homecoming. And especially in the perspective of an exile. Language becomes your home. Language becomes you. I'm thinking about, there is this wonderful poet, Mahmoud Darwish. He's a Palestinian poet. He knew a thing or two about exile. And he said in one of his odes, I am my language. You ask me what I am, you ask me where I am my language. And so in a sense, also Dante's insistence on the use of the Toscan, on his beautiful Florentine language, as compared to the language of the barbarians, for example, the Lombards, right? We're not very refined. But there is a sort of idea that his home is in his poem. And I know it sounds cliched, but as a sort of voluntary exile myself, sometimes I think, there is something that sounds a lot like home in your own language. There is a sense of melancholia that sometimes you can only fulfill with going into your language. So I don't know if that answers your disappointment about the end of Paradise, but
I almost feel like it's a great relief to know that he's going to return to living in time, I mean, as much as I love the experience of reading, I think in a way, thinking with Dante so hard about these different kinds of eternities makes me long for the experience of living in time. And, at the end, I feel like the reader understands that part of the gift of this experience is that he gets to keep being a human being for a little while. And that seems suddenly endowed with more beauty than when he woke up lost.
At least we tried to, I don't know, there. How about that?
I have a question about this beautiful painting of Canto on a Purgatory, where Virgil scoops the water of the river and washes Dante's face. And the words used, at least my relation, was that a color returned Dante's face that was gone, had been somehow gone or lifted from the purgatory and the inferno. And I'm wondering about when you think that color he lost in Inferno is, what he regains. And being partially after Mr. Kramer's question about his psychological forgiveness and anger, kind of wrath he experienced a little bit. And the Inferno also about maybe love, because he regained kind of love there. I'm just curious if I could go more on that color returning.
well, color and Beatrice are fundamentally related. The first time that Dante meets Beatrice, she's dressed in red. But color is also related to a kind of love that Dante is trying to take his distance from. So for the Provençal and for Cavalcanti, the effects of love on your body are sort of strange tremors, but extreme pallor, right? So like the whiteness of the face, tremors of the body. Love is a devastating experience when it's not rechanneled through the intellect towards a higher purpose. And so I think that part of the regaining of color in Dante and the explosion of color in Purgatory is this idea of the beginning of an ascension towards a different universe that doesn't have the darkness and the stasis and the paralyzing influence of Inferno.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's interesting because you expect it just to be the grime of Inferno washed off, and you expect maybe this process to be a kind of moment of clarification, and that's what the ascending is going to be, like we're leaving the kind of brutality and carnality of hell, and we're going to sort of move forward. But what comes back is color and blood, and precisely the body comes rushing back into the world. And Purgatorio is very sensitive to what it is to have a body, what it is to cast a shadow that you see in front of yourself. It's actually like, in some ways I almost think it's more embodied than anything that happens in Inferno. The text becomes a body, right? He gets panicked about running out of paper, and he's talking about like the materiality of the book, and so I think it's a really important movement that happens there.
I also think it's moving just because, it's, and maybe this is related to the embodiment, but this incredible friendship that he and Virgil have the whole time, suddenly that friendship is so intimate that Virgil is going to wash his face, it's incredibly tactile and, yeah, that closeness between them.
What was the hand that we did? Maybe this will be the last question.
Okay, so I'm wondering how personhood of God. So, I think that it seems possible to look at the whole afterlife system as it's kind of made once and for all. Hell is made, the gate of hell is made before man is made to come into it. And you could think of it as a system that is made once and for all and laid out so that whatever man does and chooses, he goes where he's going to go. And in purgatory, he goes where he's going to go, and then he rises up according to the system that's been in place. And I'm just wondering where God as a person comes into this, because there are guys who are people who kind of have God shine through them. And that's something, of course, that is important. But I don't know, the only way that I can think of to address it is that God is moved by prayers for the people in purgatory. But that still seems connected to this sort of pre-established system. Maybe that's not fair to say. Yeah, it's just holding God in a way that feels very abstract. I think that's all I have to say about that.
I mean, when the soul finally does rise, there's an earthquake, which seems like a violation of natural system. So it does seem like the structure is set up, but the moment, when Statius finally gets to ascend, what's described as sort of a break of the, like an earthquake. And I think that suggests that whatever's happening is not systematic or is not methodically determined, but it's like closer to an earthquake in spiritual terms or emotional terms. I don't know what that says about the personhood of God, but I think there's an important break in the structure when the soul rises. And that, I think, that must be Dante's idea. I mean, I don't know if he took that from someone, but he must just have been thinking, like, it's got to be kind of special when a soul finally gets released. Like, what is it going to be? And he chooses the earthquake as the phenomenon.
Very cynically, sometimes I think that the earthquake is also a very good narrative device because he uses it in order to faint and therefore to pass from canto 3 to canto 4. So that's very handy. Right? Whoops, I'm scared, I faint. I don't have to describe the passage.
This is where we turn and we see an old man. Is that how this ends?
We were joking about that before. I thought that sounds like first dates and like prom or something. And then there's like the other. Thank you all, and thanks again to all.